"2023 is going to see the release of multiple high-profile video game remakes. In fact, one of them is already out, and I reviewed it. Spoiler, I think it was fantastic. The topic of video game remakes is one that I've touched on before, specifically following the year 2020, which was absolutely stuffed to the brim with a huge selection of them. Seriously, there were so many remakes released in that year, some of them probably escape you right now as you are trying to recall them. But in that video, I mostly touched on the approaches certain remakes take, on a fairly broad level too, using 3 specific games as the basis. Demon's Souls as a remake that mechanically changed very little, Resident Evil 3 which changed a lot in respect to content, and Final Fantasy VII Remake, which was in a unique category of its own while still technically not being just a remake at all. But for a while now, I've been wanting to expand my opinion on remakes even further, because the discussion around them is taking up a rapidly growing space within the community discourse. Video game remakes are starting to become more and more commonplace, especially at the AAA level. Their quality and the magnitude of changes from their original counterpart are wildly varied. The scale is made even more complicated by remasters, and how the two concepts overlap and differ. In some cases, it feels like a game classified as a remaster makes more remarkable and experience-altering changes than a full-on remake does. Until somewhat recently, remastering a game was just bumping up the display resolution and frame rate, adding better anti-aliasing, and maybe cleaning up some textures. But clearly, the standard has since changed. Honestly, I'm just going to admit up front that there's a good possibility that a lot of the discourse surrounding remakes is simply caused by the industry's total lack of proper naming and categorization of these types of games. Both remasters and remakes are sliding scales when it comes to the amount of things they alter and the extent which they are altered. Yet we typically only have these two terms to go by, and I can see how that can muddy the conversation. By just using games that came out since the end of 2020, I can provide an example. There's The Last of Us Part 1, a remake which was praised for greater visual fidelity, even if it didn't feel too substantial to some people, considering the original game came out only 9 years prior and got a remaster for the PlayStation 4. But it was also criticized for not taking the chance to make significant gameplay changes, especially in an effort to make it feel more like The Last of Us Part 2. On the flip side, we have the recent Crisis Core Reunion, a remaster, which not only boasts remarkable visual upgrades due to the fact that the original release was a 2007 PSP game, but also noteworthy and stress-reducing quality of life features that modernize the gameplay in all the right ways. The only reason it's still within the remaster boundary and not crossing over into remake territory is because the game still uses the same skeletal structure as the PSP game. Square ported the game's code, which was written in C++, over to Unreal Engine, and placed higher fidelity assets over the pre-existing rigging and animations. Because of this, a significant portion of the game was technically not remade from the ground up. Honestly, it might seem kind of over-scrupulous or pedantic to some people to create such a distinction, but this is just how it goes. Even Square themselves call it a remaster instead of a remake. While the boundaries of the former can be pretty nebulous and hazy, the definition of the latter is still fairly clear. A remake is a game that recreates an older title from the ground up with new assets, typically for the purpose of modernizing the controls, adding more mechanics, beefing up graphical quality to take advantage of modern hardware, or to expand or change elements of the original game's narrative. But even then, remakes are often divided into 2 further sections: reimaginative to signify huge changes, and faithful or intact to signify very few, aside from graphics of course. Remasters can also be given an identical division between simple to suggest a resolution and performance increase for modern hardware, and maybe a few minor gameplay tweaks to meet modern standards. and major to suggest new visual assets, significant gameplay changes, and possibly even minor story changes and new voice acting. Labeling aside, in this video I want to dive deeper into my own feelings about remakes, and there's a lot of things to discuss here. But let's start off by jumping into probably the more controversial angle of this conversation, and the most foundational. What are my thoughts on the mere existence or prevalence of remakes within the video game industry? And how do I feel about them from an artistic or creative viewpoint? This is a topic that can get some people going. I've seen the rants. I've seen the scornful comments about how creatively bankrupt remakes are, how their existence is an inherently malicious move to erase the original, and how they're just cash grabs with no respect or sincerity put into them. If you expect me to start going into detail about how much I agree with these criticisms, I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you, because I don't. I never put the original game on a pedestal, no matter how flawless I believe it is or how much sentiment I may have for it. At the end of the day, many of the most beloved and admired games are still media to consume and made to generate a profit. I believe that creating reinterpretations of an older work is a right that all art and media has and should have. Obviously, whether I feel those reinterpretations are good or not is a different story. It's a case-by-case basis. But I don't want to erase remakes, nor do I even dislike them. If I had to choose, I actually kinda want more of them. Let me explain. I know this is going to feel long-winded and probably even a completely unnecessary point to make for most of you, but I want to start this discussion at the most basic of basic points. Remakes are obviously not exclusive to video games. Movies have them, music has them, and even literature has them. For movies, some of the greatest and dearest classics happen to be remakes. John Sturgis's The Magnificent Seven is a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars is a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo. Brian De Palma's Scarface is an admittedly loose remake of Howard Hawks' 1932 film of the same name. Martin Scorsese's The Departed is a remake of Andrew Lau's and Alan Mock's Infernal Affairs. And, while this is stretching things a bit, Star Wars was bordering on being a remake of yet another Kurosawa film, The Hidden Fortress. So on and so forth. For literature, remakes come in the form of retellings or reimaginings, often taking characters and plot points from older stories and placing them in different settings. For example, Shakespeare is retold and reimagined all the goddamn time, as are Greek and Norse mythology. I've also seen Don Quixote and James Joyce's Ulysses get reimagined too. And then there's music, where remakes come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. In fact, in some sectors of the music industry, good remakes are actively sought after, specifically in classical music, where remakes are referred to as interpretations, because we don't have original recordings of Mozart or Beethoven to listen to, since that technology didn't exist yet. So arrangers and conductors may imagine these pieces differently, especially from an emotional standpoint. It doesn't matter if there's one specific arrangement that most everyone prefers. Others will still attempt their own. There are many ways to interpret a single piece of music. You can emphasize certain parts and de-emphasize others. You can go faster or slower. You can make one phrase very hectic and rushed, or make it slow and melancholy, etc. And then in modern music, we have covers, which are not only fairly common, but in some circumstances, they are actively welcomed. In rare cases, covers even surpass the original in both popularity and critical reception, even when the original was already really good. Probably the most well-known example I could give is Johnny Cash's cover of Nine Inch Nails' Hurt. Both versions are fantastic, but Cash's version was so well performed and emotionally resonant that Trent Reznor himself felt that the song was no longer his own. A song that was very personal to Reznor when he wrote it was reinterpreted by a then-living legend from a totally different era and genre, and given new context that was still very personal and meaningful to Cash's own circumstances. Now, I know you're probably thinking, well, that's nice and all, but what the fuck does this have to do with video games? Well, I'll finally tell you. All those forms of media have their own remakes, but unlike movies, unlike music, and unlike literature, video games have one specific attribute that makes them unique. One attribute that drastically increases the number of avenues for a single game to be reinterpreted: interactivity. I know it's somewhat difficult for a game or any type of media that's hugely collaborative between hundreds of people working as a team to create the same deeply personal meaning as a song performed by one person. But the experience in playing it can still hold a lot of precious meaning for the individual player, because interactivity is a very subjective aspect of the medium. 100 people can play the same game, and in similar ways, and walk away from it with wildly different thoughts about every piece of the interactive experience they had. From the combat, to how the player character moves, to how menus work, to how stats and equipment are linked, to how the world is navigated, and more. Video game remakes aren't just about prettier graphics. They are an opportunity to totally recontextualize the journey by changing how we interact with it. And this is the main reason why I want more reimaginative or additive remakes to exist. I want them to take advantage of the one thing that makes video games unique and use it to alter the subjective experience by adding more function and content to the same design principles that the original stood on. That's the real challenge, and that's what can make remakes a truly interesting exercise in creativity. As I said earlier, I have seen the rants people make about how remakes are inherently creatively bankrupt and exist solely to overwrite the original, or at least imply that the original is inferior, dated, or otherwise undesirable in some way. They're cash grabs and wastes of resources that would have been better spent on a new IP or even a sequel. Remakes are representative of everything greedy and lazy in the industry. I'm not going to say that I don't understand the train of thought that led to them to feel this way. The industry has had no shortage of reasons to be cynical about pretty much everything going on within. However, the intensity with which people profess their distaste, not in tone, but in wording, can make their complaints come off as alarmism. They appear to clutch their pearls about remakes because instead of viewing them as mere reinterpretations of previous works, they view them as hostile erasure of beloved classics. It's a bad faith argument that automatically puts every remake in an unfavorable and undignified position at the very point of conception, regardless of why they are made, even on the occasion when the original is still readily available for purchase, or when it's the creators of the original who are also creating the remake, which is not that uncommon. The sanctity that some people force on video games honestly stinks of pomposity. If you believe that video games are art, then why can't they be open to reinterpretation like any other type of art can, especially when they have a trait, interactivity, that is unique to them and can open up a huge amount of possibilities. And if you don't believe video games are art, then why have this overzealous protection at all? The idea that something is too sacred to be reinterpreted is antithetical to art and creative expression in general. Necessity is not a requirement for a creative project to come to fruition. It only requires the will and resources of a creator, regardless if anyone asked them to make it. Remakes don't need a good reason to be made. A studio wants to do it, so it happens, and the consumers decide if it was worth it. That's it. I know that a very big source of this anger and frustration directed towards remakes is the lack of availability for some of the original games, but I don't think the two are really all that tied together as much as one may think, at least not at an intrinsic level. As a guy who wants better game availability in general, I understand the irritation, believe me. I've made multiple videos about it. It almost gives me a stomachache knowing how many good games are trapped on the PlayStation 3 and other platforms with no native backwards compatibility support on any modern machine. making ownership of old hardware or emulation a necessity for anyone who wants to go back and play them. I still groan in annoyance whenever I remind myself of all the games that have been delisted because of expired licenses for vehicles, aircrafts, music, historical footage, etc. Sometimes as little as 4 years after the game first releases. But remakes are not the source of the issue. If anything, they are a side effect at most. It's not the fault of the concept of remakes that much of the industry has had piss-poor standards for preservation and long-term availability essentially since the beginning. Recently, a lot of remakes are ones that receive demand to be made in spite of the original still being available for purchase, such as Final Fantasy VII, Dead Space, Resident Evil 4, Mafia, and Like a Dragon Ishin, which, admittedly, was still not in English, but no one told RGG Studio to completely remake the game. Western Like a Dragon fans would have easily accepted just a normal localization of the original game. I know I would have. I've seen people use older versions of Dark Souls, Skyrim, and Grand Theft Auto being unceremoniously removed from Steam and other digital stores as examples of old games being wiped away. But none of those are remakes. This is definitely an issue we should complain about. I am not saying that it isn't. But it is not tied exclusively to remakes. I think the availability of the original games is a problem that can be divorced entirely from the remake discussion and instead placed in the subject of general consumer friendliness and video game preservation, because that's what it really boils down to. If people want a remake of a game, they will ask for it even if they have a copy of the original for 12 different platforms and could buy more right this moment on any digital storefront. I will definitely say that I think that the best move overall is to bundle the original game with the remake, even if the publisher has to resort to packing an emulator into the game files to run it at all because they no longer have the game's source code to do a real remaster, which is the story for many old games, including some of the best and most respected titles of all time. It's sad, but true. The art versus product discussion comes up sometimes as well, suggesting that the original has a more dignified existence by the virtue of being the original. But, as unromantic as it might sound, some of those classics you love so much were made to either capitalize on the popularity of a genre or franchise or generally chase trends. This doesn't suddenly make them bad or ill-intended games. Profit is assumed to be the default goal of any game that comes out, remake or not. Some people zoom in a bit more by saying that a new IP would be a more worthy undertaking than a remake of any old game, but I don't really buy that either. There's never a guarantee that a new IP will be good, or even have good ideas, just because they're a new IP. They might be given a little bit of leeway in the face of specific shortcomings, but even they can be creatively shallow or guilty of being shameless clones, wannabe spiritual successors, or flagrantly transparent endeavors at following trends. I remember only a few months ago when many people were oh so certain that the Callisto Protocol would be a better Dead Space successor than the upcoming Dead Space remake itself. So much for that. Some games have the names of once admired creators attached to them, using their association to drive up hype and expectations, only to fall flat on day zero. Some studios known for hit after hit might throw their hat into a new ring, only to release their first true, unambiguous stinker. An ambitious indie dev might let their aspirations get the better of them and end up putting out a half-baked product that barely even exists. And probably the biggest thing is that every time a certain game explodes in monetary success, a ton of new IP coattail writers show up to coast on that popularity. Many of us are aware of all the Battle Royale games that have appeared since the rise of PUBG and Fortnite, showing up on the scene with vigor and a vision, thinking they'll be the last ones standing in the rumble, only to immediately die in a shallow grave with barely $1 to their name. Some of those games were good and had good ideas of their own, but they still existed to chase the big bucks going into this new, immensely popular genre, regardless of being a new IP. This also happened further back with hero shooters after Overwatch, then further back with MOBAs, then further back with MMOs. I'm sure many of us recall the numerous pathetic attempts at WoW killers. So on and so forth, going all the way to Street Fighter II in the early 90s, where a metric fuck ton of fighting games, ranging from unrepentant dogshit to actual solid titles, came out to float on the success of Capcom's new head-to-head style of multiplayer combat. So I don't buy the line of thinking that a new IP is more artistically dignified simply by being a new IP. It needs more than that. Personally, I feel like remakes share the same space as sequels in regard to artistic integrity. Like remakes, a sequel is sometimes worse than its predecessor, sometimes ruining character arcs or offering less content. Sequels are often seen as, and meant to be, cash grabs too, even the best ones. But sequels can be more of a wild card than remakes because at least remakes have an original to serve as a guideline. Sequels tend to expand into new territory within the same universe, and sometimes that's not always for the best. I think we all have at least one sequel in our heads, whether it's a game, show, movie, or book, that we feel added nothing worthwhile to the mythos of the previous work. In some cases, the sequel might make the previous work look less appealing and worsen it. Sequels can also dramatically change the familiar gameplay of a series to the point where it feels like a mechanical reimagining anyway. I still remember all the Doom purists ranting and raging about Eternal not being a true Doom game because it dared to have platforming and a general emphasis on mobility. I still see fans of Yakuza refusing to play 7 because it's a turn-based RPG and no longer a brawler, no matter how many times I or other fans strongly reiterate that it is still very much a Yakuza game at heart. And don't even get me fucking started on Final Fantasy's changes over the years and the obnoxious drama queens reacting to those changes. Remakes are not the only things that can alter a series down to its core functions. Sequels do it all the time. Thus, I really don't think remakes are any more guilty of being shameless milking attempts or drastic transformations than regular sequels are. In fact, let me pose to you a quick question. You don't have to actually answer, just think about it for a moment. How many of your favorite games are sequels, prequels, or spin-offs? I'll be honest, they make up a pretty big chunk of my own list. I think that pretty much covers my opinions on the more controversial side of the remake conversation. To summarize, I don't think remakes are a bad thing. I don't think they are any more shameless cash grabs than a normal sequel, and I don't think they suffer from a lack of artistic integrity by being remakes. And I don't subscribe to the idea that remakes are inherently implying the original is undesirable. I actually quite like remakes. At worst, they're not as good as the original, and we can go on pretending the remake never happened. The status quo is more or less maintained, with only the occasional clueless newcomer wandering into the remake first. At best, the remake is a genuine upgrade in almost every conceivable way and is preferable to the original, 9 times out of 10. I think the benefits of a good remake outweigh the detriments of a bad one, and this is why I welcome them with open arms. Moving beyond all that and into the territory of the kinds of remakes that exist, what are the expectations of a remake? What is a remake obligated to do? The reason this discussion seems so pervasive is because it comes up every single time a major remake is released. There's always a group of players who believe a remake should have done this, or should have that. It's a mosh pit of conflicting thoughts on what being a remake means. It can get pretty exhausting, because every appearance of the conversation just ends up sounding the same. The faithfulness level a remake has for the original goes anywhere from basically the exact same game but prettier, all the way to significant changes, almost a different game entirely. And many are caught up in arguing about which is the correct spot for all remakes to be. But it's not a black and white choice, it's a sliding scale. In some cases, the developers want to create modern, more intuitive controls and expand story details, and possibly switch the gameplay genre entirely. In other cases, all they want is to make mechanically the same game, but with nicer graphics and maybe some minor plot adjustments. Ideally, in every instance, the approach they happen to choose is the one that feels best suited for the game. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way, but when it does, it's an obvious success. For example, Bluepoint didn't change much to Shadow of the Colossus, either mechanically or narratively, and I think damn near everybody would agree that this was the right move, as the original game was considered practically perfect as its own isolated experience. It was one of the first games to unequivocally pierce the conversation of games as art, so messing with its legacy too much would have alienated more than it would have attracted. Maybe they could have gotten away with some mechanical tweaks, or maybe even implementing some of the colossi that got cut from the original game. But any attempt at narrative expansion would have likely been met with disdain, as it's the lack of hyper-detailed lore and plot specifics that bolster the desolate feeling of the journey and the impact of the ending. On the opposite end of the scale, we have one of the best video game remakes of all time, Resident Evil for the GameCube. The remake of the first Resident Evil game, which released only 6 years prior on the PlayStation 1. Sounds like a pretty short amount of time to pass before giving a game the remake treatment. But gaming technology grew a lot in those 6 years. A mind-blowing amount, really. The remake took an already good game and made it excellent with a plethora of mechanical changes and expansions and narrative reworkings to better fit the series' growing continuity. It's the pinnacle of traditional survival horror games. It's well-paced, suspenseful, loaded with content, and has solid visuals that still hold up today. It's the picture-perfect example of a reimaginative or additive remake done right. Just weeks ago, the Dead Space remake was also getting compared positively to the Resident Evil remake. Many, including me, feel like it's the best remake since that legendary GameCube title. It expanded the location of the Ishimura, turning it into a more complex setting with a much greater sense of exploration. It gave more mechanical nuance to weapons, stasis, and telekinesis. It added lore details from other Dead Space media. It let Isaac Clarke talk. And it had a ton of excellent quality of life changes. Not only is it a first-class remake, it's probably the best Dead Space game now too. Additive or reimaginative remakes that seek to expand the experience tend to be more common than intact remakes that seek to maintain almost 100% of the game's original mechanics, subtleties, and maybe even quirks and glitches. Intact remakes have their place, sure, but their primary weakness is that this type of remake accomplishes little that a decent remaster couldn't also do. In fact, a basic remaster of the original might even be preferred in situations where it's hard to access and play, or perhaps just straight up not available at all anymore. This is where the conversation shifts back to the availability issue I mentioned earlier, where remakes get the blame. For example, there's Demon's Souls, another remake helmed by Bluepoint. I know some people already have issues with artistic changes to it, but regarding mechanics and content, it is basically the same game. In fact, a full PS3 build of the original game is in the files of the remake, handling all of the internal logic, while Bluepoint's own engine is simply pasting the fancy new assets over it. I do enjoy playing the remake, but it made me realize something. It's not a remake I enjoy because it's a particularly stellar remake or anything. I only enjoy it because I already love the game it's remaking to begin with. It's a remake that's just designed from the get-go to stand behind the original, simply as an alternative for those who can't or don't want to play the 2009 game. That's all. And while it's probably for the best that Demon's Souls in particular did not stray too far mechanically, especially considering its importance to the whole Souls-like genre and the fact that the original is still stranded on the PS3, it got me thinking about the innate disadvantage that these ultra-faithful remakes have by deliberately placing themselves as close to the original as possible without any aspiration to take a step beyond it. It just opens the door for more scrutinizing comparisons. It's a barrier that requires a more reimaginative approach to really get over, as I feel like a large portion of the reluctance or straight up disdain some people have for remakes stems from their innate preference of the original. When the time comes to weigh up a remake to the original, I feel like something a lot of people do, even if they don't realize it, is use this idealized version of the original they have in their head, the one that holds the magic of that impressionable first playthrough, and they want the remake to capture that magic again. But if it doesn't, then it's a failure that doesn't justify its existence. Part of me understands why people do that, but part of me also finds it unfair, because that puts the remake in a spot where it has to not only provide an overall improved video game experience, but it also has to overcome potentially a decade or more of gathered sentimentality for the original in that first playthrough. But regardless, an intact remake is much more likely to fail that comparison. I personally feel that the single greatest shortcoming of intact remakes is lacking the ambition to do more than its original counterpart. I know I mentioned that some games are considered too perfect to make changes to without being lambasted, but those games are extremely rare, an exception, not the rule. A lot of people thought Dead Space was a perfect game until the remake came out with a shocking amount of improvements and quality of life additions. Ultra-faithful remakes are destined to sit in the shadow of their original versions, because that's where they are designed to be. From the perspective of a one-to-one remake, the original is a goal to accomplish, the final stage. Once you reach it, you can stop. You don't need to do more. Occasionally, they still do include some sensible minor adjustments or much-needed rebalancing to very specific parts, which may be enough to push it forward as an overall better designed product. But whether the subjective experience of the player is better or not is still very much up for debate, because with a remake that seeks to change very little, it also takes very little for the original to still be preferred. A remake with fewer ways to set itself apart from the original means fewer ways to make its own reputation and stand on its own 2 feet. A lot of people are very apprehensive about the upcoming Silent Hill 2 remake, as it seems to be one of those rare games where an intact remake is preferred. So even if it ends up being good, it's only furthering the legacy of the original and not making one for itself. Once again, Resident Evil for the GameCube is an excellent example here too, because even though it's a remake, it has its own distinct reputation. It's not just a derivative of the 1996 game, it is its own entity. If someone says they're interested in playing Resident Evil 1, the most common response, besides assuming they're talking about the remake to begin with, is asking, the original or the remake? Because they are totally separate experiences and are both worthwhile to play for different reasons. But if the person in question only has the time or interest to play one or the other, 9 out of 10 people will suggest playing the remake. Hell, maybe even all 10. I know some people think that remakes should strive to be ultra-faithful remakes as a general rule, but excluding cases where the original isn't easily available anymore, I don't really agree. In fact, I dare say that people who stubbornly insist that intact remakes are the only way to go are actively hurting the potential creativity or improvements that could go into any given remake, creating stagnation with the concept that they might end up complaining about anyway because they still end up preferring the original. To summarize, I believe that these one-to-one recreations are typically wasted opportunities to expand on content and mechanics. In the absolute best case, these intact remakes are still just optimal substitutes for people who cannot access the old game. Even when they do everything right, the shadow of their original counterpart still looms over them. I think that's unfortunate. I personally believe that the ideal remake stands side by side with the original instead, as two distinct but equally worthwhile experiences. It is a high bar to reach, I know, but I would like to at least see more remakes try to grab it. I guess this pretty much covers my more personal thoughts on video game remakes. To reiterate one final time, I am not anti-remake. If anything, I kinda want more of them. But if I had to choose, I would want them to at least have the ambition to see the original game as a standard to try and beat, as opposed to a standard to meekly approach and sit at. Remakes have a place, just like any sequel, prequel, or spin-off does. They are not creatively bankrupt just because they're remakes, nor does the existence of a remake imply that the original is bad. I hope that, with time, that small subsection of the video game community drops this strange allergy to remakes and starts to see them as reinterpretation of art instead of hostile erasure of old classics. Sorry if the video ended up being long-winded and kind of fatty. I wanted to make sure every conceivable base was covered, but even then, I might have still forgotten a point or two. This did end up longer than I expected, to be honest. This concludes my video on video game remakes. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.